December 25th, 1991. 7:32 p.m. Moscow time. The Soviet flag comes down over the Kremlin for the last time. Mikhail Gorbachev has just resigned. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a superpower that existed for 69 years, 247 days, ceases to exist. Not in a decade, not in a year, in the time it takes to lower a piece of fabric. Here's what people don't understand about that moment. 6 years earlier, in 1985, the USSR looked invincible. They had 40,000 nuclear weapons, enough to destroy every major city on Earth 10 times over. They had 5 million soldiers, the world's largest tank force, a space station orbiting overhead. They controlled half of Europe. They had client states on every continent, intelligence agencies in every Western capital, and 300 million people living under one political system that had survived world wars, famines, and purges. And then it vanished. Not gradually, not through military defeat, not through foreign invasion. It just stopped existing. The Soviet Union didn't lose a war in 1991. It dissolved, like it was never really there to begin with. So here's the question that should terrify you. How does a nuclear superpower with the world's largest military just cease to exist in less time than it takes to complete a college degree? Everyone thinks they know the answer. They'll tell you it was Reagan's military spending. They'll say it was the Berlin Wall falling. They'll mention Rocky Falper and Pope John Paul II and the CIA. They're wrong. This wasn't about ideology. This wasn't about communism versus capitalism. This wasn't about American speeches or freedom movements or the color of anyone's flag. This was about 5 economic decisions that mathematically guaranteed collapse. 5 choices that turned a superpower into a historical footnote in 900 days. Let me show you the 5 economic miscalculations that killed the Soviet Union. Because the pattern isn't ideological, it's mathematical, and math doesn't negotiate. Let's go back to 1928, Moscow. Stalin stands before the Politburo with a blueprint that will build an empire and guarantee its destruction in the same document. This is decision number 1, central planning over markets. Here's what Stalin proposed. The State Planning Committee, Gosplan, would calculate every price, allocate every resource, and determine every production quota for the entire Soviet economy. Not some of it, all of it. Every factory, every farm, every mine, every store. The promise sounded scientific. Rational allocation instead of chaotic markets. Efficiency through mathematics. No more boom and bust cycles. No more capitalist waste. Just pure calculated optimization. The reality was mathematical insanity. By the 1980s, Gosplan was setting over 70,000 prices annually. 70,000 individual calculations for what everything should cost. Steel, bread, shoes, tractors, electricity, toilet paper, everything. But here's the problem that killed them. Without real prices, you can't calculate real value. Without value, you can't optimize. Without optimization, you waste everything. Let me show you what this looked like in practice. Soviet refrigerators in the 1970s weighed 3 times more than Western models. Not because they were better, because factories were paid by weight. Heavier refrigerator, more money. The system rewarded mass, not quality. Not efficiency, not innovation, just kilograms. So Soviet citizens got refrigerators that could survive a nuclear blast but couldn't keep milk cold for 3 days. That was decision 1. Here's decision 2. Heavy industry over consumer goods. Stalin's obsession. Steel, coal, concrete, weapons. The numbers tell you everything. 85% of the budget went to heavy industry. 15% to consumer goods. Build tanks, not textiles. Produce missiles, not shoes. By the 1960s, the USSR manufactured more steel than the United States, but fewer shoes than Italy. More cement than West Germany, but worse housing. They could launch satellites, but couldn't make decent toilet paper. A nation that can orbit the Earth but can't clothe its people is solving the wrong problems. And in the 1960s, those wrong solutions started cracking. Let's jump to the 1960s. Soviet economists start noticing something in their classified reports. Something they don't dare say out loud. The growth rate is slowing, not declining gradually, stopping. Between 1950 and 1960, Soviet GDP grew 5.7% annually. Between 1960 and 1970, it drops to 5.2%. Between 1970 and 1980, it falls to 2.6%. And then, in the early 1980s, it hits zero. Not slow growth, zero growth. For 15 years, the Soviet economy was frozen while the rest of the world accelerated past them. But in 1960, they made decision number 3, the oil trap. Massive oil and gas deposits discovered in Siberia, hundreds of billions of barrels, natural gas fields that stretched for thousands of square miles. And suddenly, the USSR had easy money. Oil revenue jumped from $2 billion in 1970 to $32 billion in 1980. 16 times increase in a decade. The temptation was irresistible. Why fix broken factories when oil money covered the losses? Why reform inefficient agriculture when you could buy grain with petrodollars? Why innovate when you could just drill? Oil money is economic morphine. It kills the pain while the disease spreads underneath. Soviet factories kept using 1930s technology because nobody had to care. Oil revenue masked everything. By 1985, 60% of Soviet hard currency came from oil and gas exports. 60%. They weren't running an economy. They were running a gas station with nuclear weapons. And here's what should terrify you about that number. Soviet worker productivity was 55% of American levels in 1960. By 1975, it had dropped to 38%. They were getting worse while getting richer. The USSR filed 80,000 patents annually, but commercialized almost none of them. Soviet engineers knew their equipment was obsolete, but replacing it required planning cycles of 5 to 7 years. By the time new technology was approved, it was already outdated. The agricultural failure tells you everything. The USSR had more farmland than any country in Europe. And by the 1970s, they were importing grain from the United States, from their ideological enemy, because central planning had destroyed incentives so thoroughly that Soviet farms couldn't feed Soviet citizens. And then came the decision that accelerated everything. December 1979. The Kremlin makes a decision that will bleed them dry. Soviet tanks roll into Afghanistan to prop up a collapsing communist government. The military brass promises it will take 3 weeks, maybe a month. What they got was a decade-long hemorrhage that exposed every weakness in their entire system. This was decision number 4, military overextension at precisely the moment they could least afford it. The official cost was $8 to $10 billion per year. The real cost was the revelation. Soviet helicopter pilots watched Afghan farmers with $300 Stinger missiles shoot down $12 million helicopters. The math was unsustainable. 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, 50,000 wounded. And for what? A war they couldn't win, didn't need, and couldn't afford. Afghanistan wasn't just bleeding money. It was gutting national morale and proving to the world that the mighty Soviet military could be defeated by insurgents in the mountains. But here's what made it catastrophic. March 1983. Ronald Reagan announces the Strategic Defense Initiative. Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system. Soviet military analysts ran the numbers and calculated it would cost $1 trillion to counter. $1 trillion. Their entire GDP in 1985 was only $2.5 trillion. They faced an impossible choice: match SDI and collapse economically, or concede and collapse strategically. So they tried to do both. Soviet military spending hit 25 to 30% of GDP. Compare that to the United States at 6%. They were spending 5 times more of their economy on weapons than their main adversary. And then oil prices collapsed. 1985 to 1986, crude drops from $32 per barrel to $10. Soviet revenue plummets 40% in 18 months. Afghanistan is bleeding them. The arms race is bankrupting them. Oil money has vanished, and consumer goods are scarcer than ever. By 1985, the USSR was spending 30% of GDP on military, earning 60% less from oil, fighting an unwinnable war, and their actual economic growth wasn't slow. It was negative. They weren't stagnating anymore. They were dying. And that's when they made the final fatal decision. March 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party. At 54 years old, he's the youngest Soviet leader in decades. He inherits an economy in freefall, negative growth, $400 billion in external debt. Oil revenue collapsed, and he makes a diagnosis that sounds reasonable. The system needs restructuring, not replacement. He believes in controlled reform, gradual change, the fatal assumption that you can have partial transformation of a totally centralized system. This is decision number 5, perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness. And these reforms don't save the Soviet Union, they accelerate its disintegration. Perestroika launches in 1987. The plan allows some private enterprise while maintaining state quotas. Factories can now set some prices but still have central planning targets. It's economic schizophrenia. Neither market efficiency nor plan stability, just chaos. By 1989, 40% of Soviet enterprises are losing money. The supply chain collapses because when you remove 3 bricks from the bottom of a tower, it doesn't settle. It falls. Then comes glasnost in 1986. Gorbachev wants transparency to fight corruption. What he gets is revelation. Chernobyl explodes in April 1986 and glasnost forces honesty. The disaster reveals systemic incompetence at every level. Soviet citizens learn their living standards are 40 years behind the West. They discover the statistics were lies. The economic growth was fiction. The propaganda was fantasy. Once people know you've been lying for 70 years, they stop believing you when you finally tell the truth. The cascade begins. Eastern Europe breaks away in 6 months. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. Gone. Soviet republics declare sovereignty. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania lead the way. Eventually, all 15 republics. Inter-republic trade collapses by 1991. Shortages everywhere. Hardliners attempt a coup in August 1991 to reverse the reforms. They fail in 3 days. Gorbachev tried to reform the unreformable. You can't partly decentralize a centrally planned economy. It's like being partly pregnant. The whole structure was interdependent. Touch one piece and everything unravels. By December 1991, there's nothing left to save. The Soviet Union doesn't collapse despite the reforms. It collapses because of them. So let me show you what really killed the USSR. 5 economic decisions, 5 mathematical certainties. Decision number 1, central planning. You can't calculate without prices? Check. Soviet factories made their quotas but destroyed value. They hit their targets and missed reality. When Gosplan set 70,000 prices by committee, they weren't running an economy. They were running a simulation that had no connection to actual human needs. Decision number 2, heavy industry obsession. You can't sustain a superpower that can't feed or clothe its people. Check. Military might, civilian misery. Steel mills that ran 3 shifts while shoe factories sat idle. A nation that could split atoms but couldn't produce a decent pair of jeans. Decision number 3, the oil trap. Resource dependency kills innovation. Check. When oil prices fell, the economy had no other foundation. 60% of hard currency from one commodity. The moment that commodity collapsed, everything collapsed with it. No diversification, no resilience. Just a resource curse dressed up as geopolitical power. Decision number 4, military overextension. You can't outspend your own GDP. Check. Afghanistan plus the arms race equals 30% of GDP to military while citizens stood in breadlines. 10,000 tanks but empty grocery stores. 40,000 nuclear weapons but crumbling hospitals. Decision number 5, half-measure reforms. You can't half-fix a system built entirely on control. Check. Gorbachev's reforms didn't save the USSR. They accelerated its collapse. Perestroika and glasnost were the final push that sent the whole structure over the edge. Not ideology, not willpower, not Reagan's speeches. Math. When your economy doesn't grow for 15 years, when 60% of revenue comes from a single commodity, when you spend 30% of GDP on military, when you try to centrally plan 70,000 prices, when you reform without actually changing the system, the sequence is locked in. The USSR wasn't defeated. It was mathematically inevitable. Here's what should keep you awake at night. Every major economy today is vulnerable to at least 2 of these 5 decisions. Resource-dependent economies are still caught in the oil trap. Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, still making the same mistake. Military overextension is happening right now in multiple countries. Any economy where government allocates more than markets is repeating the central planning error. And half-measure reforms are everywhere. Trying to fix debt with more debt? Trying to fix inflation with price controls? The same mathematical traps wearing different names. The USSR collapsed in 900 days from Berlin Wall to dissolution. Not decades, 3 years. The pattern doesn't care about your ideology. It cares about math. And math always wins. The USSR thought they were too big to fail. They had nuclear weapons, a space program, 300 million people, and 70 years of history. On December 25, 1991, none of it mattered. Economic reality doesn't negotiate.